the territory of Louisiana roughly 10,000 years ago. First traces of permanent settlement, ushering in the Archaic Period, appear at about 5,500 years ago. The area formed part of the Eastern Agricultural Complex. The Marksville culture emerges about 2,000 years ago out of the earlier Tchefuncte culture. It is considered ancestral to the Natchez and Taensa peoples. About 1,000 years ago, the Mississippian culture emerged from the Woodland Period. The emergence of the southeastern ceremonial complex coincides with the adoption of maize agriculture and chiefdom-level complex social organization, beginning in c. 1200 CE. The Mississippian culture mostly disappeared before the 16th century, with the exception of some Natchez communities that maintained Mississippian cultural practices into the 18th century. European influence begins in the 16th century, and Louisiana became a colony of the Kingdom of France in 1682 and passed to Spain in 1763. It became part of the United States following the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Antebellum Louisiana was a leading slave state. In 1860, 47% of the population was enslaved. Louisiana seceded from the Union on 26 January 1861. New Orleans, the largest city in the entire South and strategically important as a port city, was taken by federal troops on 25 April 1862. During the Reconstruction era, Louisiana was part of the 5th Military District. In 1898, the white Democratic, planter-dominated legislature passed a new disfranchising constitution, whose effect was immediate and long-lasting. The disfranchisement of African Americans did not end until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Prehistory. Lithic stage. The Dalton tradition is a late Paleo-Indian and early Archaic projectile point tradition, appearing in much of southeast North America around 8500–7900 BC. Archaic Period. During the Archaic Period, Louisiana was home to the earliest mound complex in North America and one of the earliest dated complex constructions in the Americas, the Watson Break site near Monroe. It has been dated to about 3400 BCE. The site appears to have been abandoned about 2800. By 2200, during the late Archaic Period, the Poverty Point culture occupied much of Louisiana and was spread into several surrounding states. Evidence of this culture has been found at more than 100 sites, including the Jacktown site near Belzoni, Mississippi. The largest and best-known site is near modern-day Epes, Louisiana, at Poverty Point. The Poverty Point culture may have hit its peak around 1500, making it the first complex culture and possibly the first tribal culture, not only in the Mississippi Delta but in the present-day United States. Its people were in villages that extended for nearly 100 miles across the Mississippi River. It lasted until approximately 700 BCE. Woodland Period. The Poverty Point culture was followed by the Tchefuncte and Lake Cormorant cultures of the titular period, local manifestations of early Woodland Period. These descendant cultures differed from Poverty Point culture in trading over shorter distances, creating less massive public projects, completely adopting ceramics for storage and cooking. The Tchefuncte culture were the first people in Louisiana to make larger amounts of pottery. Ceramics from the Tchefuncte culture have been found in sites from eastern Texas to eastern Florida, and from coastal Louisiana to southern Arkansas. These cultures lasted until 200 CE. The Middle Woodland Period started in Louisiana with the Marksville Culture in the southern and eastern part of the state and the Forchmaline Culture in the northwestern part of the state. The Marksville Culture takes its name from the Marksville prehistoric Indian site in Avayelles Parish, Louisiana. These cultures were contemporaneous with the Hopewell cultures of Ohio and Illinois, and participated in the Hopewell Exchange Network. At this time, populations became more sedentary and began to establish semi-permanent villages and to practice agriculture, planting various cultigens of the Eastern Agricultural Complex. The populations began to expand, and trade with various non-local peoples also began to increase. Trade with peoples to the southwest brought the bow and arrow. An increase in the hierarchical structuring of the societies began during this period, although it is not clear whether it was internally developed or borrowed from the Hopewell. The dead were treated in increasingly elaborate ways, as the first burial mounds are built at this time. Political power begins to be consolidated. The first platform mounds and ritual centers were constructed as part of the development of a hereditary, political and religious leadership. By 400 CE in the eastern part of the state, the late Woodland Period had begun with the Baytown and Troyville cultures, and later the Coles Creek culture. Archaeologists have traditionally viewed the late Woodland as a time of cultural decline after the florescence of the Hopewell peoples. Late Woodland sites, with the exception of sites along the Florida Gulf Coast, tend to be small when compared with Middle Woodland sites. Although settlement size was small, there was an increase in the number of late woodland sites over Middle Woodland sites, indicating a population increase. These factors tend to mark the late Woodland Period as an expansive period, not one of a cultural collapse, where the Baytown peoples began to build more dispersed settlements. The Troyville people instead continued building major earthwork centers. The type site for the culture, the Troyville earthworks, once had the second tallest pre-Columbian mound in North America and the tallest in Louisiana at 82 feet in height. The Coles Creek culture from 700 to 1200 CE marks a significant change in the cultural history of the area. Population increased dramatically, and there is strong evidence of a growing cultural and political complexity, especially by the end of the Coles Creek sequence. Although many of the classic traits of chiefdom societies are not yet manifested, by 1000 CE the formation of simple elite polities had begun. Coles Creek sites are found in present-day Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Texas. Many Coles Creek sites were erected over earlier Woodland Period mortuary mounds, leading researchers to speculate that emerging elites were symbolically and physically appropriating dead ancestors to emphasize and project their own authority. Mississippian Period. The Mississippian Period in Louisiana sees the emergence of the Plaquemine and the Caddo in Mississippian cultures. This period is when extensive maize agriculture is adopted. The Plaquemine culture in the lower Mississippi River Valley in western Mississippi and eastern Louisiana begins in 1200 CE and goes to about 1400 CE. Good examples of this culture are the Medora site, Fitzhugh Mounds, Transylvania Mounds, and Scott Place Mounds in Louisiana, and the Anna Emerald, Winterville and Holly Bluff sites located in Mississippi. Plaquemine culture was contemporaneous with the Middle Mississippian culture at the Cahokia site near St. Louis, Missouri. By 1000 CE in the northwestern part of the state, the Forchmaline culture had evolved into the Caddo in Mississippian culture. By 1400 CE, Plaquemine had started to hybridize through contact with Middle Mississippian cultures to the north and became what archaeologists term Plaquemine Mississippian. These peoples are considered ancestral to historic groups encountered by the first Europeans in the area, the Natchez and Taensa peoples. The Caddoan Mississippians covered a large territory, including what is now eastern Oklahoma, western Arkansas, northeast Texas, and northwest Louisiana. Archaeological evidence that the cultural continuity is unbroken from prehistory to the present, and that the direct ancestors of the Caddo and related Caddo language speakers in prehistoric times and at first European contact and the modern Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma is unquestioned today. Native groups at time of European settlement. The following groups are known to have inhabited the state's territory when the Europeans began colonization: the Choctaw Nation, the Bayugula, in areas directly north of the Chitimacha's in the parishes of St. Helena, Tangipahoa, Washington, East Baton Rouge, West Baton Rouge, Livingston, and St. Tammany. They were allied with the Quinipisamugulacha in St. Tammany Parish, the Houma in the east and West Feliciana and Point Coupe parishes north of the town named for them, the Okaloosa in Point Coupe Parish, the Akalapisa in St. Tammany Parish. They were allied with the Tangipahoa in Tangipahoa Parish, the Natchez Nation, the Avoyal, in parts of Avayelles and Concordia parishes along the Mississippi River, the Taensa, in northeastern Louisiana, particularly Tensas Parish, the Caddo Confederacy, the Adai in Natchez Parish, the Natchez Confederacy consisting of the Natchez in Natchez Parish, the Yatazi and Nakasa in the Caddo and Bossier parishes, the Dusion in Natchez Parish, and Washita in the Caldwell Parish, the Artacoppa in southwestern Louisiana in Vermilion, Cameron, Lafayette, Acadia, Jefferson Davis, and Calcasieu parishes. They were allied with the Appaloosa in St. Landry Parish, the Chitimacha in the southeastern parishes of Iberia, Assumption, St. Mary, Lower Street, Martin, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. James Street, John the Baptist, St. Charles, Jefferson, Orleans, St. Bernard, and Plaquemines. They were allied with the Washer in Assumption Parish, the Chewasher in Terrebonne Parish, and the Yarganichito to the east, the Tunica in northeastern parishes of Tensas, Madison, East Carroll and West Carroll, and the related Coroa in East Carroll Parish. Many current place names in the state, including Atchafalaya, Natchitoches, Caddo, Houma, Tangipahoa, and Avoyal, are transliterations of those used in various Native American languages. European contact. The first European explorers to visit Louisiana came in 1528 when a Spanish expedition led by Panfilo de Narvaez located the mouth of the Mississippi River. In 1542, Hernando de Soto's expedition skirted to the north and west of the state and then followed the Mississippi River down to the Gulf of Mexico. In 1543, the expedition encountered hostile tribes all along river. Natives followed the boats in large canoes, shooting arrows at the soldiers for days on end as they drifted through the territory. The Spanish, whose crossbows had long ceased working, had no effective offensive weapons on the water and were forced to rely on the remaining armor and sleeping mats to block the arrows. About 11 Spaniards were killed along this stretch and many more wounded. Neither of the explorations made any claims to the territory for Spain. French exploration and colonization. European interest in Louisiana was dormant until the late 17th century, when French expeditions, which had imperial, religious and commercial aims, established a foothold on the Mississippi River and Gulf Coast. With its first settlements, France laid claim to a vast region of North America and set out to establish a commercial empire and French nation stretching from the Gulf of Mexico through Canada. It was also establishing settlements in Canada, from the Maritimes westward along the St. Lawrence River and into the region surrounding the Great Lakes. The French explorer Robert Cavelier de La Salle named the region Louisiana in 1682 to honor France's King Louis XIV. The first permanent settlement, Fort Maurepas, was founded in 1699 by Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, a French military officer from Canada. The French colony of Louisiana originally claimed all the land on both sides of the Mississippi River and north to French territory in Canada around the Great Lakes. A royal ordinance of 1722, following the transfer of the Illinois country's governance from Canada to Louisiana, may have featured the broadest definition of the region: all land claimed by France south of the Great Lakes between the Rocky Mountains and the Alleghenies. A generation later, trade conflicts between Canada and Louisiana led to a more defined boundary between the French colonies. In 1745, Louisiana Governor-General Vaudreuil set the northern and eastern bounds of his domain as the Wabash Valley up to the mouth of the Vermilion River, for their northwest to La Roche on the Illinois River, and from the west to the mouth of the Rock River. Thus, Vincennes and Peoria were the limit of Louisiana reach. The outposts at Weirton, Chicago, Fort Miamis and Prairie du Chien operated as dependencies of Canada. This boundary between Canada and Louisiana remained in effect until the Treaty of Paris in 1763, after which France surrendered its remaining territory east of the Mississippi, except for New Orleans, to Great Britain. As part of a general report on conditions in the newly conquered lands, Gen. Thomas Gage, then commandant at Montreal, explained in 1762 that, although the boundary between Louisiana and Canada wasn't exact, it was understood the upper Mississippi above the mouth of the Illinois was in Canadian trading territory. The French established an important and lucrative fur trade in the northern areas, which became increasingly important. It competed with the Dutch, and later English, across the northern tier for fur trade with the Native Americans. The fur trade also helped cement alliances between Europeans and Native American tribes. The settlement of Natchez was established in 1714 by Louis Judge Ons Treaty, making it the oldest permanent settlement in the territory that then composed the Louisiana colony. The French settlement had two purposes: to establish trade with the Spanish in Texas via the old San Antonio Road, which ended at Natchez, and to deter Spanish advances into Louisiana. The settlement soon became a flourishing river port and crossroads. Sugarcane plantations were developed first. In the 19th century, cotton plantations were developed along the river. Over time, planters developed large plantations but also lived in fine homes in a growing town, a pattern repeated in New Orleans and other places. Louisiana's French settlements contributed to further exploration and outposts. They were concentrated along the banks of the Mississippi and its major tributaries, from Louisiana to as far north as the region called the Illinois Country, in modern-day Indiana, Illinois and Missouri. Initially Mobile and Biloxi served the capital of the colony. In 1722, recognizing the importance of the Mississippi River to trade and military interests, France made New Orleans the seat of civilian and military authority. The Illinois Country exported its grain surpluses down the Mississippi to New Orleans, which climate could not support their cultivation. The lower country of Louisiana depended on the Illinois French for survival through much of the 18th century. European settlement in the Louisiana colony was not exclusively French. In the 1720s, German immigrants settled along the Mississippi River in a region referred to as the German Coast. Africans and early slavery. In 1719, two French ships arrived in New Orleans, the Duc du Maine and the Aurore, carrying the first African slaves to Louisiana for labor. From 1718 to 1750, traders transported thousands of captive Africans to Louisiana from the Senegambian coast, the West African region of the interior of modern Benin, and from the coast of modern Democratic Republic of the Congo-Angola border. French shipping records contained much more details about slaves' origins than did those in the English colonies. Researchers have found that approximately 2,000 persons originated from the upper West African slave ports from St. Louis, Senegal to Cap Apollonia, several hundred kilometers to the south. An additional 2,000 were exported from the port of Whydah, and roughly 300 departed from Cabinda. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall has argued that, due to historical and administrative ties between France and Senegal, two-thirds of the slaves brought to Louisiana by the French slave trade came from Senegambia. Quote, "This assertion is not universally accepted. This region between the Senegal and Gambia rivers had peoples who were closely related through history. Three of the principal languages, Seria, Wolof and Pulaar, were related, and Malinke, spoken by the Mande people to the east, was mutually intelligible with them." Midlo Hall says that this concentration of peoples from one region of Africa strongly shaped Louisiana Creole culture. Peter Caron says that the geographic and perhaps linguistic connection among many African captives did not necessarily imply developing a common culture in Louisiana. They likely differed in religions. Some slaves from Senegambia were Muslims, while most followed the traditional spiritual practices. Many were likely captives taken in the Islamic jihads that engulfed the region from Fouta Djallon to Fouta Toro and Fouta Bundu in the early 18th century. The inland territories of the African continent from which slaves were captured were enormous. Commentators may have attributed more similarities to slaves taken from among these areas than the Africans recognized among themselves at the time. Spanish interregnum. France was forced to cede most of its territory east of the Mississippi to the Kingdom of Great Britain after its defeat in the 7 Years' War. The area around New Orleans and the parishes around Lake Pontchartrain, along with the rest of Louisiana, became a possession of Spain after the 7 Years' War by the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Spanish rule did not affect the pace of Francophone immigration to the territory, which increased due to the English expulsion of the Acadians from Canada. Several thousand French-speaking refugees from Acadia migrated to Louisiana after expulsion by the newly ascendant British. After conflicts in Canada, the first group of around 200 arrived in 1765, led by Joseph Broussard. They settled chiefly in the southwestern Louisiana region now called Acadiana. The Acadian refugees were welcomed by the Spanish as additions of Catholic population. The descendants came to be called Cajuns. Some Spanish-speaking immigrants arrived, Canary Islanders, called Isle Nose. They immigrated to Louisiana between 1778 and 1783. The southwestern area around Lake Charles was settled in the late 1700s. Both free and enslaved populations increased rapidly during the years of Spanish rule, as new settlers and Creoles imported large numbers of slaves to work on plantations. Although some American settlers brought slaves with them who were native to Virginia and North Carolina, the Point Coupe inventories of the late 18th century showed that most most slaves brought by traders came directly from Africa. In 1763, settlements from New Orleans to Pointe Coupée included 3,654 free persons and 4,598 slaves. By the 1800 census, which included West Florida, there were 19,852 free persons and 24,264 slaves in Lower Louisiana. Although the censuses do not always cover the same territory, the slaves became the majority of the population during these years. Records during Spanish rule were not as well documented as with the French slave trade, making it difficult to trace African origins. The volume of slaves imported from Africa resulted in what historian Gwendolyn Midlo Hall called the Reafricanization of Lower Louisiana, which strongly influenced the culture. In 1800, France's Napoleon Bonaparte reacquired Louisiana from Spain in the Treaty of San Ildefonso, an arrangement kept secret for some 2 years. Documents have revealed that he harbored secret ambitions to reconstruct a large colonial empire in the Americas. This notion faltered, however, after the French attempt to reconquer Saint-Domingue after its revolution ended in failure, with the loss of 2/3 of the more than 20,000 troops sent to the island to suppress the revolution. After French withdrawal in 1803, Haiti declared its independence in 1804 as the Second Republic in the Western Hemisphere, incorporation into the United States and antebellum years. As a result of his setbacks, Napoleon gave up his dreams of American empire and sold Louisiana to the United States. The U.S. divided the land into 2 territories, the Territory of Orleans, which became the state of Louisiana in 1812, and a District of Louisiana, which consisted of the vast lands not included in the Orleans Territory, extending west of the Mississippi River north to Canada. The Florida parishes were annexed from the short-lived and strategically important Republic of West Florida by proclamation of President James Madison in 1810. The Haitian Revolution resulted in a major emigration of refugees to Louisiana, where they settled chiefly in New Orleans. The thousands of Haitian immigrants included many free people of color, whites, and enslaved Africans. Some refugees had earlier gone to Cuba, and came from Cuba in another wave of immigration in 1809. The free people of color added substantially to the Creoles of color community in New Orleans. The immigrants enlarged the French-speaking community. In 1811, the largest slave revolt in American history, the German Coast Uprising, took place in the Orleans Territory. Between 64 and 500 slaves rose up on the German coast, 40 miles upriver of New Orleans, and marched to within 20 miles of the city gates. All of the limited number of U.S. troops were gathered to suppress the revolt, as well as citizen militias. State of Louisiana. Louisiana became U.S. state on April 30, 1812. The western boundary of Louisiana with Spanish Texas remained in dispute until the Adams-Ons Treaty of 1819, which was formally ratified in 1821. The area referred to as the Sabine Free State, serving as a neutral buffer zone, as well as a haven for criminals, also called No Man's Land. This part of central and southwestern Louisiana was settled in part by a mixed race people known as Redbones. With the growth of settlement in the Midwest and Deep South during the early decades of the 19th century, trade and shipping increased markedly in New Orleans. Produce and products moved out of the Midwest down the Mississippi River for shipment overseas, and international ships docked at New Orleans with imports to send into the interior. The port was crowded with steamboats, flatboats, and sailing ships, and workers speaking languages from many nations. New Orleans was the major port for the export of cotton and sugar. The city's population grew and the region became quite wealthy. More than the rest of the Deep South, it attracted immigrants for the many jobs in the city. The richest citizens imported fine goods, wine, furnishings, and fabrics. By 1840, New Orleans had the biggest slave market in the United States, which contributed greatly to the economy. It had become one of the wealthiest cities and the third largest city in the nation. The ban on importation of slaves had increased demand in the domestic market. During these decades after the American Revolutionary War, more than 1 million enslaved African Americans underwent forced migration from the Upper South to the Deep South, 2/3 of them in the slave trade. Others were transported by slaveholders as they moved west for new lands. With changing agriculture in the Upper South as planters shifted from tobacco to less labor-intensive mixed agriculture, planters had excess laborers. Many sold slaves to traders to take to the Deep South. Slaves were driven by traders overland from the Upper South and transported to New Orleans and other coastal markets by ship in the coastwise slave trade. After sales in New Orleans, steamboats operating on the Mississippi transported slaves upstream to markets or plantation destinations at Natchez and Memphis.